If you step back and contemplate the vast canvas of human history, your mind is instantly drawn toward the towering pyramids of Egypt, the mighty legions of Rome, or the magnificent palaces of imperial China. But hidden beneath the dust of time, there is an invention far more humble, far more silent, and yet far more powerful than all of those things combined. That invention is writing. But not the writing of the Greeks, not the Latin alphabet that dominates the modern world, but the writing systems born far from the shores of Europe, in places where great civilizations rose and fell, and left behind their most precious gift, the power to remember. For centuries, mainstream world history has imposed a familiar prejudice, that civilization truly began when the Greeks wrote philosophy, or when the Romans carved their laws into stone. But what is the actual truth hidden behind that historical curtain? It is entirely an illusion, manufactured with deliberate intent, a giant blind spot obscured by Eurocentrism, centering Europe as the core, combined with sheer laziness in traditional textbook compilation. Because long before European ships crossed the oceans, long before the Latin alphabet spread across the globe, three non-Western writing systems had already changed the course of humanity forever. One was born from the mud of Mesopotamia, one rose from the rivers of China, and one survived in the mountain monasteries of Ethiopia. Three writing systems. Three different paths, yet all sharing one sacred mission: to record memory, to build empires, and to connect humanity across time and space. Today, we are going to completely shatter those artificial borders, to step into the profound depths of these forgotten writing systems, where entire civilizations invented the greatest tools ever created to defeat forgetfulness. But before we travel back thousands of years, we must first understand the crisis that gave birth to writing itself. Imagine a world without writing. No books, no letters, no laws carved in stone, no records of who owns what land or who owes what debt. For tens of thousands of years, this was simply how humanity lived. Knowledge survived only as long as someone could remember it. A wise elder dies, and generations of knowledge disappear forever. A city burns, and centuries of experience vanish overnight. A single war can erase the memory of an entire people. Human memory is extraordinary, but it is also terribly fragile. And then, more than 5,000 years ago, somewhere between two great rivers, an ordinary person holding a lump of wet clay made a discovery that would quietly reshape the future of humanity. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a philosopher, he was simply trying to solve an everyday problem. How do you count thousands of sacks of grain without forgetting even one? That simple question would give birth to something far greater than anyone could possibly imagine. Because the first writing system was never created to tell stories. It was created to remember. And from that single idea, governments would rise, empires would expand, religions would spread, science would survive, history itself would finally begin. Our first stop transports us back more than 5,000 years, to the fertile lands of ancient Mesopotamia, the birthplace of the world's first cities, and the home of humanity's very first writing system, cuneiform. But let's be clear about something right from the start. Cuneiform was not invented to record poetry. It was not invented to praise the gods. It was invented for the most mundane purpose imaginable: accounting. Imagine being responsible for thousands of sacks of barley stored inside a temple warehouse. Farmers arrived every day. Merchants departed every afternoon. Workers received food instead of wages. Animals were bought. Fields were rented. Taxes were collected. Now imagine trying to remember every single transaction without writing or numbers. It would have been impossible. And that was the crisis. The first great challenge of civilization wasn't war, it wasn't religion, it wasn't engineering, it was information. How do you keep track of thousands of people, thousands of goods, and thousands of promises without forgetting even one? For centuries, the people of Mesopotamia searched for an answer. At first, they used small clay tokens. Each tiny object represented something different: a sheep, a jar of oil, a basket of grain. The system worked for small villages. But cities kept growing. Soon hundreds of tokens became thousands. Even the tokens needed organizing. Then someone had a remarkable idea. Instead of carrying hundreds of little clay pieces, why not press their shapes directly into wet clay? It was simple, elegant, and completely revolutionary. Those tiny impressions gradually became symbols. Those symbols became records, and those records became writing. Not poems, not philosophy, not religion, Accounting. The world's first written words were business records, lists of grain, livestock inventories, tax payments, temple supplies. It may sound almost disappointing, but history often begins in the most ordinary places. The sharp edge of a reed stylus pressed tiny wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. Modern scholars would later call it cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped writing. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets filled temples, palaces, schools, and libraries. For the first time, human civilization could remember its own past. But here's where it gets truly astonishing. Once writing existed, something unexpected happened. People stopped recording only grain and taxes. They began recording laws, prayers, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, even stories. Among those stories was one that many historians consider the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of friendship, loss, death, and humanity's search for immortality. It is astonishing to think that the same writing system created for accountants would eventually preserve one of humanity's greatest stories. Cuneiform spread across the ancient Near East. It was adopted by the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Elamites. It survived for more than 3,000 years, until it was buried beneath the sands of time. But its legacy gave birth to a concept that changed the world, that knowledge could be stored outside the human brain, that memory could outlive death, that a civilization could remember itself, and that legacy would travel across continents and centuries, to inspire other civilizations to create their own writing systems. Now we journey thousands of miles to the east, to the banks of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, where another great civilization was facing a very different challenge. In ancient China, the problem was not a lack of writing. The problem was a vast empire, with millions of people, speaking hundreds of different languages and dialects. How do you rule a land where a man from the south cannot understand a man from the north? The empire would crumble without something to bind it all together, and the answer was a writing system that did not record sound, but recorded meaning. Chinese characters. Around 1200 BCE, the first characters were carved onto animal bones and turtle shells, used for divination and recording history. But it was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, who understood that writing was the most powerful weapon for unifying his empire. He standardized the characters across the entire territory, a bold decision that changed history forever. Imagine the extraordinary magic of this. A merchant from the south could not understand a single word spoken by a northerner. A soldier stationed far from home could not speak with the local farmers. But when both men looked at the same document, they understood exactly the same meaning. The sounds could be different, the pronunciation could change, but the written characters remained the same. That is the power of a meaning-based writing system. Instead of representing individual sounds like an alphabet, Chinese characters represent ideas. The eye recognizes the concept even when the ear hears something completely different. That single innovation allowed one civilization to communicate across enormous distances for more than 2,000 years. Soon official records filled government archives. Scholars copied the wisdom of earlier generations. Engineers recorded bridges, canals, and inventions. Doctors preserved centuries of medical knowledge. Historians documented the rise and fall of dynasties. The written word became the memory of an entire civilization. Generation after generation, students devoted years of their lives to mastering thousands of characters. It wasn't merely an education. It was a passport into government, into scholarship, into influence. Writing had become the bridge between talent and power, and its influence didn't stop at China's borders. The script crossed mountains, crossed seas, crossed centuries. It shaped Korea, Japan, Vietnam. One writing system had quietly become the cultural backbone of all East Asia. But here's the most remarkable part. Chinese characters did not replace the spoken languages of these regions. They coexisted with them. They adapted to them. They enriched them. This is a profound lesson, often overlooked by Western historians, that writing does not have to be phonetic to be powerful. Meaning can transcend sound. And that transcendence is what allowed Chinese characters to survive for thousands of years, while countless phonetic scripts have come and gone. Today, Chinese characters remain one of the oldest continuously used writing systems in the world. They are not merely a tool for communication, they are a living link to a civilization that has never truly died. But we cannot stop there, because another non-Western writing system awaits us in a completely different corner of the world. Far to the southwest, in the highlands of the Horn of Africa, A kingdom called Aksum created a writing system that would preserve an ancient civilization for nearly 2,000 years. Its name is Ge'ez. Now, many people have never even heard of Ge'ez, and that is exactly the problem. While Western scholars obsess over hieroglyphics and cuneiform, they have largely ignored the extraordinary script of Ethiopia. But Ge'ez is every bit as important, every bit as ancient, and every bit as powerful. Ge'ez was born from the royal inscriptions of Aksumite kings. It recorded military victories. It recorded trade agreements between kingdoms. It recorded royal decrees that outlived the rulers who issued them. Then, in the 4th century, everything changed. The kingdom of Aksum embraced Christianity, and Ge'ez gained a new, far more sacred mission. It was no longer used only to govern. Now it would preserve faith itself. Sacred texts were carefully translated into Ge'ez. Religious manuscripts were copied by hand, generation after generation. Patient scribes filled monasteries with thousands of pages written in Ge'ez. Empires rose, empires fell, trade routes disappeared, kings vanished. But inside those mountain monasteries, the words survived. Even today, although Ge'ez is no longer spoken as an everyday language, it still lives. Ethiopian priests continue to read ancient prayers in Ge'ez. Centuries-old manuscripts are still carefully preserved. A writing system created nearly 2,000 years ago continues to connect people with their past. Think about that for a moment. The kingdom that created Ge'ez has long disappeared. Its armies are gone. Its palaces lie in ruins. Its rulers have become names in history books. Yet its writing still speaks. There is something deeply remarkable about that. Because civilizations do not truly disappear when their buildings collapse. They disappear when nobody can read their memories. The pyramids still stand. Ancient temples still rise above forgotten cities. But without writing, they become silent. Stone can survive for thousands of years. But stone cannot explain itself. Writing can. Now let us step back and look at the grand pattern that emerges before our eyes. 3 writing systems. 3 different worlds. 3 completely different scripts. The Sumerians used writing to remember. The Chinese used writing to unite. The people of Aksum used writing to preserve. Yet all of them answered the very same question. How can human knowledge outlive the human mind? Perhaps that is the greatest purpose of writing. Not simply to record words, but to allow one generation to whisper to the next. Across decades, across centuries, even across entire civilizations. The narrative of a backward, illiterate, non-Western world is entirely an ideological hoax, constructed to serve as a hypocritical excuse for slaughter, plunder, and cultural assimilation. The truth is this: before European cannons descended with bottomless greed, the non-Western world possessed some of the most sophisticated writing systems ever created. Systems that managed empires. Systems that preserved sacred wisdom. Systems that united millions of people across vast distances. Cuneiform, Chinese characters, and Ge'ez are not merely ancient artifacts. They are bridges across time. They allow the dead to whisper to the living. They allow long-vanished civilizations to teach us their lessons. That is why the history of non-Western writing is not just a story about language. It is a story about power, the power to remember, the power to rule, the power to connect, and above all, the power to endure. The next time you see an ancient clay tablet, a Chinese character, or a faded Ge'ez manuscript, don't think you're looking at old writing. You are looking at humanity's greatest invention for defeating forgetfulness, and perhaps our closest attempt at achieving immortality. Thank you for joining us on today's journey through the history of non-Western writing systems. If this story changed the way you see civilization, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again as we uncover another forgotten chapter of human history. See you next time on the next grand historical journey.